Welcome to our Keys to Unlocking Educational Success webinar series dedicated to transforming education so that more children can become successful readers and learners. And today we have Jean Schedler, who's kind enough to offer a bonus session for our parents and teachers who are listening on the topic of context matters. And I love this topic, Jean. You know I do. I love the way that you cover this. I think it's so important. And we're so appreciative that you're here willing to give your time and this bonus topic to our listeners. So welcome, Jean.
Thank you, Teresa.
And Jean, maybe let's just start for anyone who has not listened to your coverage on the topic of comprehension, where you introduce yourself. Just take a few moments now and give a little bit about your background.
Okay, thank you. I started, like most of us, as a classroom teacher, second grade in a rural environment, teaching 35 kids to a room. And I became fascinated with how children learn to read. And so that sort of launched me off into reading and dyslexia, reading with struggling readers, how do we build a reading brain, tutoring, working in a special needs school, and then going on to actually trying to also learn a little bit more as I began to work with, do teacher training and train the trainers, also a little bit more about how do I make the workshop sustainable. And then so I went off on another venue, Learning Forward, where I wanted to learn about what are the standards for professional learning? How can I make the workshops that I do sustainable? So there actually are 7 standards for professional learning. And that's when I realized that the workshops I were doing, that the knowledge and skills in the workshop is necessary but not sufficient. And that's where I came across the tagline, context matters. The context in which I am delivering the workshops or working with the students, it matters. And there actually are 5 elements. Knowledge and skills are but 2. Attitude, behavior, and belief systems. What is the attitude, the behaviors, and the belief systems within the school culture in which I am working? And so you must embrace those, understand those. And the other key piece here is that the teachers in that school are the experts of that school culture, and of that student. And so my knowledge and skills needs to be integrated into that culture or translated and embraced. And then if we're going to bring about change, all of those elements need to be addressed. And so that's been my most recent passion. I'm a graduate of the Learning Forward Academy. So I'm sort of taking reading and the standards for professional learning and integrating those two together. And the biggest piece to me is that the context of the learning matters.
You know, Jean, I so agree with you. And what's coming to mind, just to even start out the gate, I remember you shared a story with me how you were doing a workshop and you purposefully set up the context, the setting, the dynamics that the teachers were walking into a certain way. You did it on purpose. And it set up a dynamic that was hard to undo. Do you want to share a little piece of that? Like you were trying to prove this very point, I believe.
I'm not sure. I've got 2 different stories in mind. You're going to have to tell me more.
The one was when the teachers walked in and you didn't have, it appeared that you didn't have the materials and you didn't.
That was actually
a brilliant idea.
It was a conference workshop actually in New York City at one of the branch conferences there. And we were doing a workshop, my colleague and I were doing a workshop on classroom management actually. And organizing the classroom. How do you organize, which is one of the things we plan to talk about, is how do you organize the classroom to make use of all instructional time? And so my colleague and I, people came in, it was the last session of the workshop on top of it, and everyone came in and asked for handouts, and we said, handouts, let me see, where are the handouts? And so, of course, we had placed them outside the room, and we went outside the room and got the handouts. And then we began to pass out the handouts, but we passed out the handouts to the last person that had entered the room versus the first person that had entered the room. And we acted like we didn't have all of the handouts.
Right.
And so then people were like, well, I want one. And so then we began in terms of, my colleague and I talked like teachers talk, co-teaching. They may chat before the classroom starts or something. And so my colleague and I began to chat, just the two of us, and then we started the lesson sort of, kind of, and our PowerPoints, weren't in a good order. And we just basically appeared not prepared.
Right.
And then we stopped and we looked at them and said we wanted them to think about how they felt, what were they feeling at this moment in time. And with the disorganization and everything, that we weren't really organized and efficient. And I said, that's how your students feel when you begin your class in an unstructured, inefficient way. And my colleague and I, we never, ever did that again, because there was so much negative energy from the participants, and it never dissipated through the entire work. Even though we then had enough handouts, we put up the real PowerPoint and we began in a very organized way. The negative energy, we never were able to dispel the negative energy that was in that room from how we had started it. So we never did that again.
I think that's just a great exercise and a really revealing example of what you're saying, how important it is when a child, and children don't even know they don't have the vocabulary, they don't know what they're walking into, but they feel something in that space. So, I mean, I think we can all think back to our favorite classrooms, because when you walked in them, I remember teachers that would have plants and pretty things, and it was organized, versus classrooms that just smelled bad. There was no lighting, too much stuff on the walls. Yeah. You get, what I mean. So where do you want to start?
Well, then let's start with, when I start with context, this particular workshop that we did actually ended up being a segue into the chapter in Multisensory Teaching of Basic Language Skills. The editor is Dr. Judith Birch. That actually is the beginning of how the chapter on classroom management and lesson planning was given birth. And that particular book is now in its 4th edition. It's coming out in September 2018. And the chapter actually ties together all the independent chapters in that particular book. And that in terms of your classroom, we begin in terms of context matters. And this is the teaching of reading within the classroom. We want to make use of every instructional moment that we're given. And so we must have our classroom organized. And we begin by organizing well before the students arrive, in terms of organizing the furniture. How are we going to arrange the furniture? And then are we going to arrange the teaching materials so that they can be efficiently accessed? And even when you're teaching reading, because now we know there's multiple components within a reading lesson, how are you going to transition from phonological awareness to phonics to fluency? Are you going to be able to efficiently transition between each of those elements within the lesson? And so all of that is done before the students enter, and you need to actually take time to organize it so it suits you and is not distracting or disruptive to the children either.
Right. It's like you have to choreograph the whole thing, where your papers are, if you're able to get to them easily. And, even I know with teachers, I always wanted them to be very aware. Things like the height of the blackboard, the size of the desk and the chair, all these things that sometimes people almost carelessly overlook. But children can be in the wrong furniture size, the boards can be too high, or a child could even be allergic to chalk dust. Like what's in that environment, right? To be
Yes.
really attuned to that, because I know there are some teachers, they are oblivious to this stuff. It doesn't bother them, or parents, they're oblivious. But you may have a child that is really impacted by that. We had students who, depending on the shampoo or cologne the teacher might be wearing, even down to vitamins. We had a teacher that took garlic, and this one student just could not handle the garlic that would, just come through. And some children are painfully sensitive to all of this, and others, it doesn't matter. But if you're a teacher and you're, let's say, oblivious to this, you are still responsible for the child who is sensitive to this. I mean, can you give some examples of bad setups or good setups that, you've seen out there?
Well, we want it set up so the children can enter the room efficiently and not bump into desks or fall over papers. And so each one is different. And this is addressed in the chapter that's coming out in the 4th edition of the book. And I actually say your teaching space, it can be a classroom, it can be a closet. I started in a closet doing intervention, or an alcove in a hallway or behind a shower curtain. It doesn't matter. If that's your teaching space, that's your teaching space. And you need to look around it with a critical eye and set it up so that when the child enters the room, all of your time, every minute, is spent in direct explicit instruction with your students, so that you're not wasting time looking for things or chatting with your fellow teacher, which is what we did in that workshop that just drove our workshop participants very impatient. They didn't like that being done to them. Neither do our students. Yeah.
Right. And Jean, one thing I had shared with you before, and I know there's many different types of teachers and parents, some highly organized. So some of you may be highly organized parents and teachers, and you have the kid who can barely get their backpack in the right area. It's on either side. The child may have this, we call it executive dysfunction. They can't organize themselves well, or the adult might. But when I share with you, when I went to hire teachers, one thing, especially teachers who were working with children who struggled to organize themselves, I knew I had to have teachers that could organize themselves. They had to set the parameters so the child could learn. And I would ask that in my interviewing of teachers, I'd say, tell me about your closet. And that was one of the barometers I would use, whether they could organize their classroom. Some would say, oh, I'm very compulsive. I have all my reds and blues and white clothes organized, and and then when some would say I have certain hangers, and I would listen and I'd smile, because I knew that their ability to deliver instruction depended on how well set up they were. And the teacher that throws all their clothes in the closet, it's on the floor, they may be kind, wonderful, fun teachers, but they may not be able to deliver this explicit instruction in a timely way. I mean, can you give some examples of classrooms or teachers or?
Well, now that we know how to build a reading brain, now that we know all the critical elements that must be present in one reading lesson, it becomes even more important than when I began teaching, where I just opened the product and read from the teacher manual, because now you must integrate all 5 or 6 components. So you have to move between components. And so it's even so much more critical that you're able to organize the classroom and then organize the lesson and deliver it within a certain amount of instructional time, so that in order for our children to benefit.
So can you tease that apart? Because, for example, one thing, like if you're a homeschool parent and you're listening to this, one thing to organize is how you set up your day. When does it begin? When does it end? When's lunch? Same with a classroom teacher, how you structure your day. But then you're also highlighting, how do you structure a lesson, like a reading lesson that's going to cover. But can you talk about these two different things and highlight them? Because sometimes a homeschooling parent may not think of it that way, or how to best organize a lesson and how to best organize your day or week. Can you kind of highlight the difference?
Gosh, there's so much, there's a process. So there's the context in which you're working, like you said, a homeschool parent or a classroom.
Right.
And then there's the process, the structured procedures, the process involved in delivering the lesson. And then the third element is the content. And the content is the knowledge and the skills. And we have focused on content and skills, whereas in order for that to be effective and sustainable, we have to go all the way back and examine the context and then the process. And so when we all of this is actually coming out in evidence-based research in terms of what kind of learning environment is most helpful for our young people that struggle to learn to read. And you talked about many of the classroom context issues, whether it be perfume or distractibility. When I go into a public school setting, is the teacher talking while the children enter the room? Is there a structured procedure? What is the process of coming into the room? We're finding that if the teacher stands at the door and greets the students, it makes a marked difference. And again, this little thing, greet the student by name when they come through the room, is a technique, whatever, that I work with my high school students, my high school teachers that are working with struggling students. That makes a difference. So that's all context pieces that that we have to look at and examine, independent of the process in which you deliver the lesson and the content of the lesson. And each of them have to be learned differently. And so the chapter that's coming up in this multisensory teaching of basic language skills by Judith Birch, we've actually taken the chapter on classroom management and lesson planning, and we've structured the chapter that's coming out in August in that format. We start by discussing the context and then the process of the delivery, which must be direct and explicit, and then go on and integrate the content of building a reading brain. And
right.
Yes. And that's why
when you describe the thing that comes to mind is sometimes children walk in a classroom and they don't know where it's beginning, they don't know where it's ending. And I remember we had a math teacher who set up a chart, and he would have a clothespin, and it had the different things that he was going to cover in that particular lesson sequence that the children could count on, like a warm up, and then there was a sequence, and then a child could get up and move that clothespin, and sometimes they even had their own charts so they could move it down, so they kind of knew where it was starting and where it was ending, and they could get the categories in their mind, and there was a routine, and that really supported the child in learning. Otherwise, they kind of were in there and they were floating around. They couldn't quite locate themselves in a lesson. And so the more organized a teacher was, the better the child was to get grounded in what they were going to cover. Is that the kind of thing that you're talking about?
What you just described is a process.
Okay.
The context is the classroom, and the agenda that you move the clothespin down is the process.
Okay.
And then the content is the math instruction that's covered that day.
Right. So the teacher has to have, and for example, we use Saxon math. It was very clear where the lesson was, what the next lesson was. So the teacher wasn't scrambling to try to figure out the next lesson. It was highly structured, sequential material, and the classroom was set up in a very conducive way to learning. The process was very clear, and the content was extremely clear. Versus a setting where the classroom is kind of a free-for-all and there's no clear sequence that's being covered. Someone should be able to know, we're covering this lesson and here's where we're headed, and when you're successful you get to move to the next one, and you have proper materials that go with the lesson. Can you speak? Sometimes with teaching reading, it is very hard to find. Teachers have to go in between and hunt and peck the materials to get the sequence that they may be using. Do you want to speak to that? I mean, just the material organization is a job in and of itself.
Well, once the National Reading Panel came out with the 5 elements of each successful lesson, the publishing companies, anyone that had a product around reading had to go back in and document where the 5 elements were. And that was where we started after the National Reading Panel. And that was necessary. But what they have now found out is that while it's necessary, it's not sufficient. So now the publishing companies are now being challenged, the bar is raised, that they must show the 5 elements, but there must be some sort of instructional sequence to these elements. It's not enough that they just be present in the reading or present in the lesson. We're now looking at what is the sequence of instruction. Now, each of the 5 elements has its own scope and sequence. So if you look at, and it's very exciting because phonemic awareness was like brand new kid on the block, and we knew it was important, but we didn't know anything about it. And now actually have enough evidence and research to actually have a scope and sequence around phonological awareness. And phonics instruction, there's multiple scope and sequence depending on the writer or the author, but there's a general acceptance of what every first grader should know, every second grader, every third grader. And so each of those pieces now have to be, the scope and sequence of each of those elements needs to sort of be adhered to in some of the products that are out there. And so again, now let's go back to the culture of the school. We have to look at the culture and what materials are being used for the teaching of reading within that particular school. And is it meeting the needs of those particular students? And that's where you begin to look at some of the other elements around the standards for professional learning in terms of data. We look at the data, the student data and the teacher data. And the teacher data is around what do the teachers need to know in order to teach the children how to read. And then we have to look at the student data, because it's only by changing the teacher data that the student data is going to change. So if the children aren't being successful on the reading scores, then you have to go through a process of what needs to be changed. Is it the product that you're using? What is the issues? Where are the strengths? And those are, all of those, now we're going back to context or culture, and what is the process of instruction, and then you get to content.
Jean, I used to be on the Reading First committee that went into failing schools in Maryland, Virginia, and Washington. And the goal there was to retrain teachers on these essential elements. So what is phonemic awareness? What is phonics? And they would get these instructions. And then we wanted to test the teachers, just because these schools were failing. The scores were abysmal in these schools. But, the teachers union came in and said, you cannot test these teachers. A lot of money was being spent to retool, to educate the teachers. But the union said, no, you can ask the teacher, how did they feel about the workshop? Did they like it or not? But you could not test to see if they had those skills that the children needed. And so there was this gap, there. So we never, and the scores, they spent a lot of money and the scores really did not go up.
No, that's where change, change is slow and there's resistance to change, but that's the only way that it's going to be sustainable. That's where I said the knowledge and skills is necessary, but not sufficient. So we have to go into the culture of the school and what is the belief system, attitude, and behaviors of the teachers around these new knowledge and skills? And how do we bring about that change? And that's the study of 7 standards for professional learning. How do we bring that, whether it be change in math or change in reading? And I embraced it around how do we implement a change in reading.
And it's interesting when you say that, because we know that when we started to train a lot of teachers and we got teachers this information, or special education teachers would go take advanced courses, you still have to have that principal, that key leadership position has to be able to also go up that learning curve, or else they won't use it. They won't free up the teacher's time. I think they thought if we targeted those teachers, we're going to get this problem fixed. But then if they did not understand the importance of that principal, shapes the whole culture, the context of that school, right? I mean, it's hugely.
It has to be at all 3 levels. It has to be at the supervisory superintendent level, needs to be on board, and the principal needs to be on board, and the teachers need to be on board. And so we've been willing to throw a lot of money at the teachers because they're the closest to the students, but without the principal supporting the teachers in terms of giving them time to collaborate, to have professional learning communities, to attend the workshops, to study, to practice, to be coached. It's not going to go anyplace. And we have found across the board that within 3 years after being trained in a product, the product is on the top shelf in a closet once the teachers that have been trained have left. And so what we're talking about here is change, the process of change. And that is slow, 3 to 5, 5 to 7 years, at 7 years really. And that's where I'm working in high schools and elementary schools, entering my 5th year and working with them, 6 years. It takes years, and schools need to be able to invest in their teachers long term and be committed to the change that's going to be needed.
Right. And you have to have the eye for it. A principal needs to be able to walk in. I remember going into schools where one teacher had a series of textbooks, and then the other class, same grade, had different materials. It's just what was in the room, and it was all kind of mixed up, and there was no clarity. And then a child might go down the hall into a special ed room and get some other instruction. So it wasn't synchronized and coordinated. And they would say, oh, well, it's just more exposure. That's better. But in fact, what was happening is they were confusing the child who already needed a very sequential, systematic program. They were now giving mixed programs, which was undermining their success, right? So a parent, I think this is important to highlight for parents who are listening. More, it isn't necessarily better.
No.
It has to be coordinated more. It has to be integrated, right? And that comes from that larger school context, understanding that these things can't just be separate instructions. They have to be very coordinated and tailored.
Well, what they found, the best example I can think about this is a speech language therapist. They used to work, you'd pull the child out and you'd work in a closet and get speech therapy. And I'm not talking about articulation, I'm talking about oral language. And then the child would go back to the classroom. And now actually speech language pathologists are now working in classrooms alongside the classroom teachers so that they can support the student within the context, instructional context, because the students would produce in the closet context, but they didn't do transfer of learning to the classroom context.
Right.
So the reading specialist could work on individuals' skills, but then the classroom teacher needs to be able to reinforce and apply those skills almost in the same language of instruction that is being expected and directly and explicitly taught perhaps in a pull-out setting.
Right.
So it's all the same. Yes.
Highlight this, Jean, to step back. Start at the smallest unit in this thing called context in a classroom, and then move up towards the principal. What are the elements, again, if you teased apart this, that a teacher needs to be aware of and thinking of, or a parent or a principal? So do that.
When I work with teachers, I use the term locus of control. What is within your locus of control? And so what's within your locus of control is your classroom. And you have to work with the materials that you have. And so you have to do the best you can with what you have. So you set up your classroom in terms of the bulletin boards and the desks, and then we start looking at the papers, and then your routine, and then the elements within your lesson. That's your locus of control. So then you get your students, and you begin to, what do they need? Well, can you reach out and get a speech language pathologist? Can you get an OT? You know, what differences are you able to make? The next piece is your principal, and your principal is your principal. His personality is his personality, and I mean, I've worked with groups of teachers where the principal is very much on board and invested. I've gone on to school campuses where I was working and mentoring teachers, and the principal said, I want to shadow you for the whole day because I want to know what you see and what you know. And so he was very, very interested. And that's great. I've had other principals that say, welcome to my school, just do whatever you need to do. And yet they still support me, even though they don't necessarily shadow me. They value what I do. And I come back and report on how it's doing and pieces like that. And we've had to move some tutors out of it or some other tutors back in. And that's positive too. And then I've had other principals that say, if I don't have you in the building, I've got to design my own intervention program. So I don't want to design my own intervention program. So, I mean, superintendent says I either have to have you or design my own. I'm not going to design my own. So yeah, you can come in, but they don't give the teachers the materials they need. They don't give them the planning time they need. They don't actually help with scheduling so that they can provide the services the child needs. Now that's counterproductive. I mean, that's a tough situation kind of piece. We do know, just like you said, the principal is the key piece, and we're now doing a lot of principal training around the importance of the principals. They have they are a key pin, linchpin, and they have a very, very difficult job. And they were not always getting the training and the support and the understanding that they needed in order to do the job that they were being asked to do. So there's a lot more being offered and available to principals. So I'm very excited about some of the principal training and the principals that are now engaged in the culture of their school.
Right. And also, we have to think that this model of public education that was developed in the 1800s, I mean, we're still using a model that's over 100 years old. The concept like an assembly line, you have all children at a certain age who fall into a bucket, and we're going to call those children grade 1. And then we're going to call the, a year older children grade 2. And the concept was that you download this information into those children, into those buckets, and then they're ready to move into the next grade on up the line. And what we find is there are many reasons that children don't move in that assembly line configuration. Either maybe they had a traumatic event in their family, a death in the family. Maybe they have a learning neurological difference. Whatever the reasons are, they're not able to move along in that herd, in that group, the way, and depending on that principal or superintendent or the larger context of understanding, they will either be passed along. That's how you end up with these 12th grade students who can't read. They've been passed along, or the system will make a program, at least it sounds like a program, and people think it's a program, like, so they get into special ed, but there's nothing too special about it. They're not getting what they need. A lot of children in special ed stay below the 12th percentile in reading. They don't get better. So, and then there's those schools and systems that know how to remediate that child and get them going. And all of that happens is that, in this larger context of belief systems that will either shape a successful way for a child who's not keeping up to get through it, or hinder them, right? They'll just...
Well, I like your word assembly line. If you look at public school education came into existence in the age of machinery, when we established the assembly lines. So
Right.
the public schools were put into existence to educate the children to go work on an assembly line.
That's right. And you know what's so interesting, Jean,
Yes.
to me about that is, like, in my mother's time, she was in Rhode Island in a community filled with immigrant children. At her time in the she was in 1920s, people were coming from all over the world into this country to work in these factory systems, and public education was to get everyone using the same language, same
Right.
hygiene skills,
Yes.
and everyone and very conscientious of time. Punctuality, getting there, attendance, that was the barometer because they wanted to make good workers. Now, those children were getting through reading and writing better than children today. And so the issue isn't, that we have foreign-born children who aren't learning the language. It's that language back then was taught very differently than language was taught in my time. In my mother's time, it was very phonetically based. She learned very foundationally. In my time, in my school, the teachers were not allowed to teach phonics. The principal pulled my mother out in the hallway and said she needs phonics, and whispered the word like if it was an F word. So and now they kind of have this blended approach, but the truth is you got a lot of teachers who went through a system and they weren't taught phonetically. So they don't have the foundation to teach it, even though the science has come back and said, teach it phonetically. There's just this gap, cultural, social gap in our teachers now in terms of having that foundation. So
the reading wars are about over. We actually now, the science there and building a reading brain is there. The industrial age, the children really only had to read about to a 3rd or 5th grade level, and you could be successful.
Right.
You could earn enough money to feed a family with about a 5th grade education. That was the reading level. So if you think about 5th grade, it's a pretty simple sentence structures, pretty simple vocabulary. But now as we launch ourselves into the 21st century, this 1800 model of public school no longer fits our needs. And so what we're actually saying is one of the pieces is we are rebuilding the plane while we fly it. And so we can't shut down schools while we rebuild the educational system. So we have to keep it flying and rebuild it at the same time to meet the needs of the 21st century. So there's a huge change. And when I say the word change, I see it all in capital letters in terms of school systems, professionals, individuals, materials. It's all out there, and change is very, very difficult and very slow, and most people are resistive to it. Right. But it is possible, and I'm working with lots of schools and professionals that, and actually they want to work collaboratively. They want to problem solve and understand, and people that, and again, the professionals that choose not to go this route, that may not be the best use of our resources, trying to bring them on board. Sometimes it's better to just let them ride off into the sunset and retire in their due and embrace these young people that are just really excited about the new model in education.
Right. But what you're really describing when you say the context in which we teach reading, we can see the classroom, we can see the school, we could even maybe see the county system with the superintendent, but what what you're highlighting when you say these industrialized models of education that we still have, that is a larger cultural context,
Yes.
societal context that
Yes.
shapes our reading experience. So
Yes.
you really, and that's why I think this topic that you are an expert on is so important to share, because it really, we have to locate ourselves in time and space. So
Yes.
we're in the year 2018. There is a mentality that's in place that impacts all the way through our culture into that classroom.
Yes.
Space is how we occupy the space of that classroom, but where we are, that's why some children, they could be in South Africa learning to read with a dirt floor and a stick, and some of their reading scores are higher than our schools that have pumped money into it, but the teachers don't have the...
That's about money. See, this is the whole thing.
Yeah.
It's not about money. If we could throw money at the educational school system, and they've tried. I mean, you talk about No Child Left Behind or National Reading Panel. They tried. They threw a bunch of money at it.
That's right.
And we're talking about people change and money not going. You can't buy a product that's going to make the difference. And so now they're coming back around and looking at how do we bring about effective, sustainable change among professionals.
Right. I mean, this is so important, because when people think it's a money problem, people know how to get out and rally and tell their politicians, put more money into education. But we know that money, if not spent the right way, it goes nowhere. When the system pumped money to retool those teachers, and we could not test those teachers to see if they even learned the material to take in the classroom, that was millions of dollars really essentially wasted.
Correct.
Right? So this is bigger than a money problem.
It is. It's not a money problem.
It really, and I think that's the thing, throwing money at this just without deep understanding to what this context is not only won't your child learn to read, but we won't raise our scores as a nation. When you look at the current reading, national reading scores reveal 66% of fourth graders in this country are not reading on grade level or comprehending on grade level. Fourth graders, 66%. And when they take low-income children from low-income homes, 80% are not reading on grade level. That is, to me, mind-blowing statistics of a very deep problem, because, in Afghanistan, the illiteracy rate was like 95%, and you have people living in the Stone Ages. Where will we be as a country or as a world if we can't help people crack this reading code, right?
Yes.
I know, Jean. We know.
We have to figure out how to allocate the dollars. When the National Reading Panel came out, you could get federally funded dollars to buy a product, but you could not use those federally funded dollars for teacher mentor, to mentor the teacher in the use of the product. You could train the teacher in the product, but you couldn't go in. There were no federally funded dollars in order to mentor. And now they're showing, in terms of, that's probably the best use of money, is to have teachers being mentored, again, by our more experienced individuals
who can show them how, and make sure they're using it, right.
And so just now, recently, dollars are being loosened up or allocated for mentorship. You can use money for professional mentoring, but only a few. So,
and also, Jean, because I think, let's tap on one other area that has to do with context, because really it's a huge issue today, which is, so let's say there's a child in a classroom, or there are a handful of children, and they're not academically keeping up with their age peers because they're not processing the same way, or the way the instruction isn't working for them, and they're not keeping up. the context of that classroom, how those children, other children perceive them, how the teacher treats them, you know, all the way up into how teachers in the teachers' lounge are talking about children that aren't keeping up the belief system, like, oh, well, it's their family, or whatever.
Yes.
Do you want to speak to that dynamic? Because I use the term bullying, but what happens to these children who aren't keeping up?
Well, children among themselves are unbelievably cruel by nature, and they want to protect themselves, so they want to draw attention to other people. And so they often
learn this. Yeah.
Right. They often, again, say unkind things, they ridicule, they tease, and they almost do it without really understanding what they're doing. And children that aren't taught how to empathize with others, they don't understand the cruelty and the feelings that's being inflicted on another child. And so I'm really glad to see the literature and the understanding around the term bullying coming out, that we're bringing it to the forefront, and there's a lot more. We've made the invisible visible. So all those unkind comments, all those shoves, all those little things that kids do to ostracize other children, picking them last or not picking them at all, or making a face. All of those are being coded, identified, talked about, and actually we're giving young children the opportunity to be better children to each other, show more kindness.
One thing I'll never, it wasn't that long ago, but when my children were in school, elementary school, there was a little boy and he had a behavior modification chart. They literally put this chart on a string and he wore it around his neck, and every half hour the teacher would either come over and give a smiley face or a frowning face. And it was horrific. I mean, and he had duct tape around his desk. He wasn't allowed to go outside the duct tape. And if the whole class was misbehaving and the teacher was frustrated, she'd just come over and put the frowning face on his chart. He'd collapse. I mean, it was child abuse. I really believe that. And I don't know what the thinking was at the time to do something like this. And then he would be humiliated at gym. The teacher wanted him to run, but his shoes were too big. And I mean, his day was this careening level of exposure of adults who really were just cruel to him. And then the children jumped on that as well. And, I tried to voice concerns and report it, and it was such a cultural phenomenon. Like children lined up to take medication. I mean, the things I would see just on and on that are considered just became normal for people in there, and they weren't normal. I mean, that too is the context that happens to these children, right?
Right. And we are also, not only the children, but also the teachers. I actually experience, when I do classroom observations, verbal abuse. Teachers can be unknowingly very, very verbally abusive. And that's just maybe how they grew up. They're not even aware that that's not constructive criticism. It's basically verbal abuse. And I can say for myself as a parent, my child, I have 4 children, and one of them, actually 2 different ones, actually came to me saying the teacher doesn't like me. And I said, oh, that's not possible, and actually was able to go in and observe each classroom, and came out, and my child was correct. That teacher in both cases was being verbally abusive. In one case, the teacher wasn't aware of it. In the other case, the teacher actually blatantly admitted it in front of the principal, who was there with me, without thinking anything was wrong with her verbal abuse of my son. So again, that was the culture they think that's discipline. And verbal abuse is not discipline. And again, there are programs now out there. Conscious discipline is one. I'm trying to think of the name of the other one, where teachers have the opportunity to actually go back and reflect upon how their own
how they were parented.
Or
right?
no, I was going to say how their own karma, well, if they come in a bad mood, and they're out of sorts, how that is reflected onto the children, or how, what is verbal abuse, and what's the opposite of that? How do I turn that around and be the teacher that I want to be?
See, that is so important too, because as we talk about what's going on in the larger culture, that affects everybody, and it affects teachers. And teachers, who are struggling, underpaid, stressed out, don't have the support, don't have things, they may not, the last thing in the world they want to do is be abusive to their students, but they are humans too. I think if I had made one mistake in my time as an administrator, I underestimated the neediness and the woundedness of the fellow adults. I really did not understand how wounded really many of the teachers were. Well-intentioned, loving, but they also grew up in this society. They went through their schools, and I really didn't understand that they needed much more attending to. And ultimately, maybe it is a money. We say money's not the issue to fix this, but if money was spent wisely by giving teachers adequate salaries and vacation time and planning time and time to go to the bathroom. My God, if anyone follows a teacher, they don't even have time to eat a lunch or go to the bathroom. And so we're not heaping on this. This is not about blame. This is about understanding what is creating these dynamics, this context, right? So these teachers reflect the larger value or lack of value, just like isn't it in Finland, where the highest reading scores right now are in, I'm blanking on the name of the country where students do so well, and these children don't have homework. They have 2 hours of recess. Teachers have, I think, 2 to 3 hours of planning time.
Right. Is it Finland? Is it Finland? I think it's Finland.
And I think it really reflects in how you treat the entire culture of learning and the people involved. And if you want to calm it all down and get it working, you put a value on it. And that does cost money, but it's spending the money in a very different way, right? So
in Finland, the teachers as a profession is respected as much as a doctor, because we're entrusting our youth and young people into them. So the best of the best go into the teaching profession. Whereas in our society, often if you can't do anything, you can at least go teach.
Right. A breathing body in a room, and then we wonder why nobody's getting further down the road. So then, just to back up, if you have a school where the principal tolerates teachers in a teaching lounge, kind of diffusing their frustration by blaming the children or their parents or, whatever, giving excuses for why these children aren't reading or learning, right? You set up a whole dynamic in there that really doesn't make it safe for that child who's a struggling learner. I mean, I know I had a school full of dyslexic children who really came out of these schools, and some were private schools, traumatized, absolutely traumatized. I had a third grader who was going to jump out of the car on the way to school rather than go to school because it was so brutal for them to be in that system as a non-learner. And they were bright. This had nothing to do with intelligence, right? They were just, the way they were being taught was not working for them. And then the dynamic, like taking away their recess, humiliating them, putting them down, just the whole thing just collided on these highly sensitive children.
Right.
I mean, you've seen that. I mean,
Yes.
and
Yeah.
then you've got to not only try to help them learn to read, but you have to recover them emotionally from the trauma, right?
And that sometimes takes a couple years.
It does. It really does. So anything else, Jean, that you want to highlight about why context matters and what, to highlight for a teacher or a parent?
I guess the biggest piece is to be aware of the context and name it. If you don't name it, then it's very elusive. And if you actually can name it, identify it, then we can take it out, examine it, and look at it. And again, I work within the context of the 7 standards of professional learning. So it enables us to take each of these issues out and examine it and look at it. And my theme line is, I want to empower teachers to be the best that they can be. And so I often see that by taking the reading workshops and putting them within the structure of the 7 standards for professional learning, that enables us to take out all the different issues that we've talked about in this particular piece, examine it, and then say, is this something we can change? What's within my influence of power, my sphere of influence? And what can I do? And even each person can slowly make a difference in the whole. And
Absolutely.
So I'm always positive, and I want to work with a teacher in their sphere of influence and empower them to be the best that they can be. That's my context.
I love that. It's wonderful. Thank you. And so much. So in closing, I want to thank our listeners for being a part of this webinar series. Thank you for taking the time out of your busy day to listen to Jean Schedler share her expertise on this topic of why context matters, and to become more aware that we're in the middle of something so much bigger than often we're aware of. And our children who don't have the language to explain and name all of this are counting on us, both the teachers and the parents, to oversee and protect them and to make sure they're in the right context for their learning styles and needs. So help us get the word out. Please share this free webinar series with your friends and families and learning communities. Until next time, best to you all. Thank you.